On a quiet Saturday morning, October 23rd, 2077, the world ended. It did not end slowly. It did not end with speeches or surrender. It ended in less than 2 hours. What history would later call the Great War was the final catastrophic chapter of the Sino-American conflict. A global thermonuclear exchange erupted between the United States and China, and within moments, the planet's most powerful nation ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Cities were vaporized, governments evaporated, billions died in nuclear fire, radiation storms, and the chaos that followed. When the sirens began, there was still a world. By the time they fell silent, there was only the wasteland. 2 centuries later, the scars remain. Lingering radiation, mutated horrors, shattered ecosystems, and civilizations clawing at survival amid the ruins. But the apocalypse did not begin in 2077. It began decades earlier. In 2151, the United States invaded Mexico to secure dwindling oil reserves. It was framed as strategic necessity. In truth, it was desperation. That invasion ignited what historians would later call the Resource Wars. A slow unraveling of global order as nations fought over the last remaining energy supplies. The European Commonwealth soon followed suit, launching its own campaign into the Middle East. The conflict spiraled. In December of 2053, Tel Aviv was annihilated by nuclear detonation, the first use of atomic weapons since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world took notice. Earlier that same year, another disaster had begun to spread: the new plague. Panic gripped the United States. Quarantines were imposed. Civil liberties eroded. Vault-Tec was commissioned to develop a cure, but that research would soon take a darker turn. Europe's wars collapsed into civil conflict. Oil fields ran dry anyway. The United Nations dissolved. Global trade fractured. And in Alaska, something else was brewing. In 2066, after the United States imposed an indefinite petroleum embargo, China responded with a full-scale invasion of Alaska. The Sino-American War had begun. Canada initially supported American logistics, but economic strain and mounting resentment boiled into resistance. When Canadian freedom fighters attempted to sabotage the Alaskan pipeline, the United States answered with annexation. Canada ceased to exist as an independent nation. Meanwhile, Vault-Tec's research into curing the new plague was quietly redirected. The government shifted focus toward weaponizing the forced evolutionary virus, or FEV. The implications horrified Chinese intelligence. By 2074, American forces counterattacked mainland China. The The military expanded to unprecedented size. In 2076, the battlefield changed forever with the deployment of the T-51 power armor. Soldiers became walking tanks, and Anchorage was reclaimed by January 2077. But victory in Alaska did not bring peace. It created stalemate in China. Peace talks failed. Fear escalated. Nuclear war loomed closer than ever. While soldiers fought overseas, powerful corporate leaders were planning for the end. Vault-Tec convened a meeting in Los Angeles with executives from Robco Industries, West-Tec, Repcon Aerospace, and Big MT. The project they presented was called Project Safe House, a network of underground vaults designed to preserve the American population in case of nuclear war. That was the public version, anyway. Privately, many vaults were intended as social experiments, controlled environments designed to test human behavior and engineer a perfect post-nuclear society under corporate oversight. One suggestion emerged during that meeting. If nuclear war was inevitable, perhaps it should be initiated deliberately. Whether that plan was ever truly enacted remains unclear. At least one attendee, Robert House, doubted the corporations would risk it, and behind the scenes, another power loomed. The Enclave, remnants of America's ruling elite, had their own designs. By the late 2070s, high-ranking officials vanished from public view, retreating to offshore oil rigs and hidden bunkers such as the White Spring facility in Appalachia. They were preparing to inherit whatever world remained. On October 10th, 2077, Captain Roger Maxson uncovered horrifying truths at Mariposa military base. West-Tec scientists had been experimenting on military prisoners with FEV. Maxson executed the researchers and issued a declaration of secession from the United States on October 20th. The government never responded. 3 days later, the world ended. At 0103 EST, unidentifiable submersible objects were detected off California's coast. At 3:37 EST, high-altitude bombers appeared near the Bering Strait. Chinese submarines maneuvered into launch positions. At 9:13 EST, the first missile launches were detected. DEFCON 2. 4 minutes later, NORAD confirmed the worst. At 9:26 EST, the president ordered retaliation. At 9:42, nuclear detonation struck Pennsylvania and New York. At 9:47, Washington, D.C. was hit. Federal infrastructure collapsed almost instantly. Missiles fell across the globe. 2 hours of nuclear exchange reduced civilizations to ash. Strategic warheads ranged from 200 to 750 kilotons. Ironically, The lower yield detonations created denser, longer-lasting fallout, injecting debris into the lower atmosphere and spreading concentrated radiation worldwide. China burned, America burned, the Earth itself was wounded. The Great War both began and ended that morning. Nuclear fire was only the beginning. Chemical and biological weapons used during the Sino-American War compounded the devastation. Climate patterns shifted violently. Agricultural systems collapsed. Common crops like wheat, maize, cocoa, opium failed in many regions. Survivors adapted to radiation-mutated variants. Mutant cabbage and maize thrived where traditional strains died. Animals mutated as well. Radiation and localized exposure to FEV reshaped ecosystems. By 2080, entirely new species had emerged. Among them was the Brahmin, a two-headed cattle mutation that proved remarkably suited to wasteland survival. It required little water, tolerated harsh conditions, and became the backbone of post-war economies. Elsewhere, mutation produced far darker outcomes. Predators warped beyond recognition. Governments disintegrated, infrastructure decayed, knowledge was lost, and societies regressed into fragmented tribes, raiders, scavengers, and isolated settlements. 200 years later, the consequences of that 2-hour exchange still define the world. Radiation storms sweep across deserts. Ruined cities glow faintly at night. And beneath the soil lie the remnants of a civilization that once believed itself to be invincible. In the hours after the detonations, nations no longer existed, only survivors. Smoke-choked skies hung over shattered cities, and in the ruins of what had once been suburbs and skylines, people turned on one another for scraps of food, bottles of clean water, and any structure still standing that might offer shelter from the fallout. Civilization did not collapse over the years. It was fractured in days. Radiation seeped into everything: soil, water, flesh. Disease spread quickly. Starvation followed. Dehydration claimed thousands. The injured, burned and irradiated, had nowhere to go. Whiskey and leftover painkillers became the closest thing to medical care most would ever see again. Even before the missile struck, emergency units and elements of the National Guard had been mobilized. But electromagnetic pulses from the detonations crippled communication networks almost instantly. Radios failed. Command chains collapsed. There was no central authority left to coordinate any sort of rescue or relief. The military tried to respond. For a brief moment, they attempted evacuations and imposed martial law in scattered regions. But the shock of nuclear annihilation shattered morale. Supplies never arrived. radiation sickness began claiming victims in waves. Soldiers deserted their posts. By the time the worst of the fallout settled, organized relief had already failed entirely. 2 centuries later, all that remains of those efforts are rusted vehicles and empty checkpoints swallowed by dust. There was one city that did not suffer a direct nuclear strike. Las Vegas survived, not by chance, but by calculation. Robert House's missile defense systems intercepted or destroyed 68 of the 77 warheads aimed at the city, and the skyline remained standing. But survival is not necessarily the same as stability. Though spared annihilation, the surrounding region still descended into chaos. For generations, Las Vegas was reduced to scattered tribes and small settlements. Only in the mid-23rd century would it begin to reclaim even a shadow of its former grandeur. Elsewhere, those who lived far from major population centers, or who managed to flee when the sirens wailed, had better odds. They still lost access to clean water, medical care, and food distribution networks, but they survived. And from those survivors, new communities were born. Junktown rose under Darkwater's leadership. The hub coalesced around Angus and trade caravans. Megaton was built around an unexploded nuclear bomb, and Diamond City took root within the skeletal remains of Fenway Park. Across the wasteland, founders carved out fragile sanctuaries amid the ruin. They were not rebuilding America. They were inventing something new entirely. Not all survivors remained unchanged. Some, caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment, endured intense radiation exposure without dying. Their skin blistered and slowed away. Their bodies withered, but refused to decay completely. They became ghouls. Though many retained their minds, their appearance inspired fear and hatred among other humans. Prejudice followed swiftly. In a world already defined by scarcity, difference became another reason for cruelty. Others found shelter underground. The Vault-Tec Corporation had constructed massive subterranean vaults in anticipation of nuclear war. A relative few reached safety behind those blast doors, but safety came at a cost. Many vaults were never intended as simple shelters. They were experiments, social, psychological, biological, designed by the forebears of what would become the Enclave. Surface horrors were replaced with confinement, manipulation, and controlled suffering. Some citizens refused to enter their assigned vaults, dismissing the sirens as another drill. They didn't realize the truth until it was far too late. Yet not every vault failed catastrophically. Vault 15's inhabitants would eventually found Shady Sands and inadvertently give rise to raider tribes such as the Khans vipers, and jackals. The Los Angeles Vault contributed to the formation of Adytum, and Vault 8 would establish Vault City. The underground shelters, flawed and often cruel, became seeds of future civilization. Though the Great War ended within hours, fragments of the old United States clung to contingency plans. The Enclave, remnants of federal leadership and high-ranking military officials, retreated to secure bunkers and offshore installations. They viewed themselves as the legitimate continuation of the United States. In Appalachia, cut off from Central Command, former Secretary of Agriculture Thomas Eckhart attempted to escalate the war further. To access nuclear silos, he engineered a threat scenario that spiraled disastrously out of control. His actions unleashed the scorched plague and ignited internal conflict, ultimately destroying the regional enclave presence. Elsewhere, non-enclave military units functioned briefly, enforcing evacuations, attempting to maintain martial law in cities like Boston, offering humanitarian aid through units such as Response Unit MD-478. But without supply lines, coordination, or hope, they too disintegrated. Across the Pacific, the fate of China's leadership remains uncertain. Yet, Chinese military assets within the United States continued operating for years after the war, sustained by infiltration networks and nuclear submarines cut off from their homeland. Many of these stranded operatives became ghouls themselves, like the remnants at Mama Dulce's factory in Washington, D.C., or the Fujinia intelligence base in Appalachia. One submarine crew chose a different path. Stranded and abandoned by history, they integrated into wasteland life and eventually formed the She in San Francisco. Proof that even enemies could adapt. The Great War's instruments did not disappear when the missiles stopped falling. Vehicles were abandoned, rusting into skeletal husks along cracked highways. One exception endured: vertibirds, preserved primarily by the Enclave and later claimed by other factions. Weapon caches from both American and Chinese forces lay buried or forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered by scavengers and warlords alike. Military robots, Mr. Gutsies and others, continued patrolling decades later, their corrupted programming rendering them hostile to any living thing. Power armor suits scattered across battlefields became trophies and tools. Raider gangs occasionally claimed them, but it was the Brotherhood of Steel who systematically tracked down and reclaimed as many as possible, wielding them as symbols of technological dominance. Even nuclear weapons themselves remained. Megaton's settlement grew around an unexploded bomb still capable of detonation. Nuclear silos in Appalachia and the Divide remained functional long after the war. Sentinel Site, Prescott, and other facilities retained operational arsenals. The apocalypse had ended, but its trigger still existed. Within a few decades, survivors no longer remembered the slogans or ideologies that had fueled the war to begin with. The political speeches, the patriotic fervor, the propaganda, it all faded into irrelevance. The wasteland did not care why bombs fell. It only cared who could find clean water. The old nations became myths, flags rotted, and borders lost all meaning. Only the enclave clung to the memory of the old United States, preserving its jingoistic pride like a relic from a world that no longer existed. For everyone else, the Great War was not about America or China. It was about survival. And in the centuries that followed, humanity did what it always does. It adapted, broken, scarred, and mutated, but alive.